What happens when corrupt cops mess with the wrong person? After all, not everyone can be intimidated by authority and weapons.
My name is Noxy, and I've gathered a few amazing stories for you about how arrogant police officers paid for their behavior. How? Watch until the end. There's a very telling video at the finish.
An Uber driver was stopped by the police, not knowing that he had accidentally picked up a passenger who was wanted by the authorities. It's just a taxi. When the criminal was arrested, the officers began treating the driver rudely, demanding he show his wallet and papers, clearly hinting at problems. Without much hesitation, he pulled out his phone and started recording.
However, the officers immediately demanded he stop filming, threatening arrest, and claiming that recording was prohibited. But they overlooked one thing.
This driver wasn't just any cabbie. He was a lawyer. Yes, driving Uber just for fun. "Hey buddy, turn it off," one of the officers commanded. "No, I'm going to keep recording. It's my right," the driver calmly replied. "Don't film me! Do you understand?" The cop fumed. "Look, you're an officer on duty. I have the right to record you. And if you come closer to the car, I'll keep doing it."
The driver stood his ground. The argument continued, with the officers insisting the driver stop filming, even threatening him with arrest.
"You don't have the right to film me. Get out of the car," they insisted. "And what will you arrest me for? I'm just sitting in my car and recording." "Well, if something happens, I'll have the evidence," the driver retorted. "Better hope we don't find anything illegal in your car," one of the officers threatened. "You won't be searching my car," the lawyer firmly stated. When he showed his ID and explained he drove for Uber just for extra money, the situation took a different turn. The driver reminded the police that in the US, people have the right to record police officers while they're on duty in public spaces. This is protected by the First Amendment of the Constitution. After this incident, an internal investigation began and the sergeant involved was fired. Here was a slightly different situation. A guy was calmly driving his silver car when he was pulled over by a patrol. "How's it going, man? Do you have a driver's license?" the officer asked. "Yeah, but what's going on?" the driver responded, a little puzzled. "I'll tell you as soon as I see who I'm talking to, okay?" the officer promised.
But what happened next surprised many. The driver, named Kelvin, was in the car with his wife and brother. He insisted on knowing the reason for the stop.
"I need to know why you stopped me. What rule did I break?" The officer refused to provide any information until the driver showed his documents. "You can do this the easy way or the hard way," the officer continued to threaten. But Kelvin didn't give in. "I'm not giving you my documents until you tell me why you stopped me." The conversation grew more tense. The officer gave an ultimatum. "Either you give me your ID or you're going to jail." This threat made Kelvin ask again for an explanation of the stop. In response, the officer called for backup to arrest the driver. As Kelvin insisted on his rights and demanded answers, 2 more officers joined. One of them didn't waste any time and smashed the car window. Can you believe that? In the end, the 3 officers forcefully dragged Kelvin out of the car, threw him to the ground, and handcuffed him, even though he had lost consciousness. But it didn't end there. They arrested his wife and brother without any explanation. Worse yet, Kelvin's money also disappeared. Fortunately, the criminal charges against Kelvin and his family were dropped in January 2017. Later, the American Civil Liberties Union filed a lawsuit against the officers for their reckless actions. On July 4th, 2023, in Ohio, there was a chase involving a truck driver named Hada Jari Rose. It all started when he was stopped by police officers from Circleville for missing a mudguard. They demanded payment on the spot.
Rose initially complied with the demands, but when he saw a gun pointed at him, he panicked and hit the gas without thinking. At the same time, he called 911 hoping for help. And remember,
this was all because of a missing mudguard. Crazy, right? A few minutes later, Rose stopped the truck and got out, only to find himself surrounded by a large number of officers. One of them, Officer Speakman, who had just arrived with his service dog, barked a few orders and then immediately released the dog on Rose. The situation escalated quickly. The dog initially ran toward the patrol officers, but then, on Speakman's command, attacked the unarmed driver. The other officers, seeing that Rose posed no threat, tried to stop Speakman and shouted for him to pull back the dog. but he ignored them. Even when Rose was already being restrained by other officers, Speakman continued to disregard orders and tried to justify his actions. When the dog was finally pulled away, Rose was in terrible condition. Despite this, he was charged with failing to comply with police orders. He hired a lawyer and is preparing for a major court case. As for Speakman, his actions didn't go unnoticed. He was fired from the police force, and he wasn't allowed to take the dog with him. In the city of Dayton, police stopped a black man named Clifford on West Grand Avenue. The incident occurred during a police investigation when officers spotted his car, which resembled a vehicle involved in a recent crime. The police asked him to exit the car for a search, but Clifford refused, explaining that he couldn't do so because he was paralyzed from the waist down. "Hello, sir. I stopped you because your window tint is too dark," the officer said. "This isn't my car," Clifford replied. The officers continued to insist. "Turn off the engine and unbuckle your seatbelt. I'm asking you to step out of the vehicle." "I can't step out. My legs are paralyzed," Clifford explained. The officer offered help. "I'll help you out," but Clifford responded that it wasn't necessary and insisted he couldn't leave the car. The officers kept pushing, demanding that he get out.
Clifford started calling for help and recorded the encounter on his phone. "They're trying to force me out. I can't get out without assistance. My legs are paralyzed." He tried to attract the attention of passers-by, asking them to film what was happening.
Despite his protests, the officers continued their attempts to forcibly pull Clifford out of the car, which resulted in injuries. He repeatedly shouted that he was in pain and demanded they stop the violence. In the end, after everything that happened, Clifford was issued a ticket for an unbuckled child in the back seat and for the overly dark window tint. They also tried to take his cash. But the story didn't end there. Clifford filed a lawsuit against the police, claiming that his civil rights were violated and that the officers caused him physical harm by pulling him out of the car by his hair. The court ruled the police's actions unlawful and awarded Clifford $125,000 in compensation. Here's an example of instant karma in action. A dashcam video that quickly spread across social media sparked a lot of discussion. At the center of it all is an arrogant SUV driver who blatantly broke traffic laws and, confident in his impunity, found himself in a pretty unpleasant situation. The events took place on a busy street in Russia.
The driver of the expensive SUV decided that the rules didn't apply to him. With a sharp maneuver, he cut off a UAZ vehicle that was driving in its own lane. But the story didn't end there.
As soon as the vehicle stopped, the SUV driver rolled down his window and started shouting threats at the UAZ driver. Among the insults and threats, the key phrase was, "I'm the head of the police. Do you even know who you're dealing with?" Obviously relying on his status, he was sure he could get away with such behavior. He hurled insults, threatened to deal with the UAZ driver, and demanded an immediate apology. I can only imagine his face when the doors of the UAZ suddenly swung open and several Oman officers in full gear jumped out. The officers quickly assessed the situation. In a matter of seconds, the SUV driver was immobilized, thrown to the ground, and detained. The dashcam video quickly racked up thousands of views and comments. People expressed their support for the actions of the Oman, noting that this is exactly how those who abuse their position and status should be dealt with.
Social media also saw discussions about the need to combat arrogance and abuse of power on the roads, especially from those who consider themselves untouchable. It later turned out that the arrogant driver was indeed a police officer, but not a high-ranking one as he had claimed.
And what happens when a corrupt cop crosses paths with an honest one? Sergeant William Mayer was called to the scene of an accident where a drunk driver had caused a crash. But then Police Chief Leonardo Guida arrived. From the start, Guida's behavior raised questions. Not only was he drunk, but he also began interfering with the investigation.
Instead of allowing Sergeant Mayer and his team to do their job, Guida started picking on Mayer's appearance. Mayer, staying calm, tried to explain that he was just doing his job and that arresting the drunk driver should be the priority, but Guida wouldn't stop. He continued to apply pressure, threatening to relieve Mayer of his duties on the spot.
At one point, the situation reached a boiling point. "You're suspended," Guida declared loudly, trying to use his authority to stop the sergeant. Mayer, refusing to back down, reminded the chief that all their actions were being recorded on video and that Guida was crossing the line by continuing his provocations. However, Guida ignored the warnings and kept interfering with the case. He insisted that his authority allowed him to make such decisions and ordered Mayer to leave the scene. As a result of this prolonged conflict, witnessed by both other officers and even bystanders, Mayer was indeed suspended from his duties on the spot. However, this incident had serious consequences, not for the sergeant, but for Guida himself. After an internal investigation prompted by his inappropriate behavior, Guida was found to be obstructing police work and was soon placed on administrative leave, followed by dismissal. It turned out he was protecting his friend for money, but ran into an officer who was too honest to be swayed.
It seems like nothing major could happen during a document check, right? In some states, the police have the right to ask for an ID or driver's license if they have reasonable suspicion that someone might be involved in criminal activity. However, simply being in an area where crimes have been reported is not enough reason for a check. Despite this, a group of police officers in Northern California
decided to do things their way and stopped a black family near a Starbucks cafe demanding either documents or money. The conversation started surprisingly harsh. The officers began talking about a recent car break-in, but the woman insisted, "Why do you need my passport? We're just resting here because I'm about to go to Starbucks. It's been open for hours." The situation escalated when the woman refused to provide her documents, stating that she wasn't obligated to do so since she hadn't done anything illegal. The police officers, ignoring her explanation, started threatening her with arrest if she didn't return to her car and wait for the check to be completed. "You're making a huge mistake," the woman repeated, trying to explain that her family had only stopped there for coffee. But the police decided to take matters into their own hands. "Get out of the car. You're going to be detained." The officers insisted that the family had something to hide, while the woman desperately tried to explain that they hadn't done anything wrong. Nevertheless, the officers decided to detain them all. They were forced out of the car, handcuffed, and arrested despite their protests. After lengthy negotiations, the family was eventually released. But the story didn't end there. The victims sued the police, accusing them of misconduct and civil rights violations. As a result, the court awarded each of the 3 family members compensation of $2.75 million, with the total amount of compensation exceeding $8 million. Not bad, right?
Here's another story of instant karma, which unfolded at a Ukrainian checkpoint where a group of police officers decided to use their position to make money off truck drivers passing through. This seemed like a routine affair. They demanded bribes for supposed violations from truck drivers.
The money was taken for fast-tracking the inspection of documents and cargo, with threats of long delays or suddenly discovered infractions. But this time they clearly messed with the wrong person. One of the truck drivers stopped by the corrupt officers happened to be a former soldier, now a contractor supplying the military. His trips were crucial for military operations, and the police officers, unaware of his connections, started their usual extortion. The demands were simple: pay or you'll be stuck here all day. Not one to fall for such tricks,
The truck driver calmly suggested that the officers consider the consequences of their actions,
hinting at his ties with the military. But these words were met with laughter and mockery. The driver was told, "We're in charge here," and if he didn't pay, his truck would be stuck until the end of the week.
Not wanting to engage in further arguments, the truck driver quietly handed over his documents and made a few phone calls.
His military connections worked surprisingly fast. Within an hour, military counterintelligence showed up at the checkpoint. They didn't waste any time. The police officers were detained on the spot, and all the money obtained through extortion was confiscated. The corruption scheme was immediately exposed, and the incident gained widespread attention, with the corrupt officers receiving real prison sentences. Fair enough, don't you think? Share your thoughts in the comments, especially if you've had any funny or bizarre encounters with the police. And if you love interesting stories, know how to write scripts, edit, or do voiceovers, join the Telegram bot through the link in the description. I'd love to collaborate. Thanks for watching.